Why was the security guard smirking? Maggie O'Brien could feel his eyes on her as she pulled the parking brake on her battered blue Honda Civic. The morning sun caught every patch of rust along the door frames, turning the faded paint into a mosaic of years gone by. 52 years old, hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail, held with what looked suspiciously like a rubber band from yesterday's newspaper. She stepped out, squinting against the light, clutching a frayed canvas tote bag with a logo from a grocery store that hadn't existed since the 90s. The guard at Fort Braxton's main gate wasn't expecting her. No one was. He leaned on the counter, broad arms straining against his uniform sleeves, his voice carrying that blend of polite formality and thinly veiled amusement. "Mom, you sure you're in the right place?" Maggie looked up over reading glasses, held together with a bit of electrical tape, her tone warm but firm. "Oh yes, dear. I'm exactly where I need to be. I'm here about the shooting range. My grandson dared me to try it, and you know how grandmothers are about their grandbabies' challenges. That got him, a laugh he tried to swallow." His partner at the checkpoint grinned openly now. Fort Braxton was not the kind of place that welcomed hobbyists or curious visitors. This was home to the Special Operations Command's most elite training facilities. Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Delta Force operatives, all trained here on ranges that broke even the most confident shooters. She didn't look like she belonged. Word of her arrival traveled faster than the morning wind. It reached Colonel Rick "Iron Mike" Morrison while he stood on the advanced tactical range, jaw tight as he watched a group of SEAL candidates fail a precision exercise. Morrison, legend of 3 tours in Afghanistan, a man whose very nickname carried the weight of steel at 48. His build could still intimidate most recruits into silence. When his staff sergeant approached, trying not to laugh, Morrison didn't even look up from his clipboard. "Sir, there's a situation at the main gate," the sergeant said. "Civilian woman says her grandson dared her to try the qualification course." The colonel's laugh was instant and loud, the kind that turned heads across the range. "A grandmother wants to play soldier? Jesus Christ, Rodriguez, what's next? Boy Scouts asking for demolitions training?" The image was too absurd. Some sweet old lady fumbling with a military rifle while his instructors scrambled to keep her from hurting herself. "Let her have her 5 minutes," Morrison said finally, shaking his head. "Give her one of the 22 pistols, set up some close targets. Send her home with a t-shirt and a participation ribbon." What Morrison didn't know, what no one at Fort Braxton knew, was that the woman at the gate had just driven 800 miles from the mountains of Montana, that she owned her own private shooting range, carved into the wild forest behind her cabin, that for the last decade she'd been living a double life. In her small Montana town, she was the quiet church organist who brought homemade cookies to every fundraiser, but in the underground world of competitive shooting, she was known by another name entirely, Montana Maggie, a ghost in the shooting circuits. Whispered about intense conversations between seasoned competitors, the woman who would show up, let the cocky men underestimate her, and then, shot by shot, dismantle their pride. She'd paid for her late husband's cancer treatments that way. More than $200,000 in prize money over 6 years. Earned one perfect grouping at a time. But here, at Fort Braxton, none of that mattered. To the soldiers who saw her walking up the concrete path, thrift store cardigan flapping, sensible walking, shoes scuffing against the ground, she was a novelty act. A joke. Rodriguez led the way, glancing over his shoulder with the polite, patronizing smile of someone who'd already decided the ending to her story. Behind them, a small group of Marines followed, curious to watch what they assumed would be 5 minutes of polite failure. "Now, ma'am," Rodriguez said as they reached the beginner section of the range, "we'll start you off real easy. Got some nice 22 caliber pistols. No kick, close targets, maybe 15 yards to start." His tone was the kind you'd use explaining a puzzle to a child. Maggie's smile didn't falter. "That's very thoughtful, dear, but I brought my own equipment." The tote bag hit the bench with a weight that didn't match its frumpy exterior. When she unzipped it, there was no yarn. No knitting needles, just custom-cut foam cradling a precision rifle case. Rodriguez hesitated. "Ma'am, I'm not sure we can allow civilian weapons on the range." He stopped mid-sentence as she opened the case. What emerged was not a weekend shooter's rifle. It was a work of art, a custom-built instrument worth more than a new car. With a carved exotic woodstock and a German-engineered scope that could resolve details invisible to the naked eye. Her hands, which had fumbled with a crumpled visitor's pass earlier, now moved with sure, practiced efficiency. It was as if another Maggie had stepped forward, one built of muscle memory, discipline, and unshakable calm. "I think I'll start with the 200-yard targets," she said. The rangemaster, Gunnery Sergeant Williams, had seen thousands of shooters in his 23 years. None had set his instincts ringing quite like this. He raised his binoculars, watching her settle into position with form, so textbook it belonged in an instructional manual. The first shot cracked across the range. Williams's coffee slipped from his fingers. Through his spotting scope, he saw it. A bullet hole dead center, so perfect it might have been measured with a ruler. The crowd murmured. A few soldiers leaned in toward the electronic scoring display, waiting for confirmation. The numbers blinked on screen. 109. Not a possible 10. Better than perfect. She didn't pause. The bolt cycled smoothly. The second round chambered and fired. Then the third. Then the fourth. Each one perfect. By the fifth shot, word was already racing through the base like wildfire. At the other end of Fort Braxton, Morrison's aide burst into the briefing room. "Sir, you need to get to the range. That woman, she just shot a perfect group at 200 yards. 5 shots, 1 hole." Morrison's pen froze over his notes. Skepticism hardened his features, but something in the young man's voice made him set the clipboard down. "Show me." By the time he arrived, Maggie was calmly studying the 500-yard. Course, it was a distance that challenged even his best snipers. "These are very difficult targets, honey," she called over casually. He didn't answer, not yet. Williams watched her pull a small weather station from her bag, taking wind and temperature readings, jotting calculations in a worn leather notebook, the kind of math that separated a lucky shot from a consistent kill. The range had gone quiet now. The laughter gone, replaced by something heavier. The realization that maybe this woman wasn't here to embarrass herself at all. She lay prone, breathing slowing, body settling into the kind of stability most recruits never achieved. The trigger broke like glass. 500 yards away, the steel rang like a bell. Why was no one breathing? Even Morrison, who prided himself on never showing his men hesitation, found himself frozen. That single perfect hit at 500 yards had landed like a hammer blow to the range's collective pride. It wasn't just that she'd hit it. It was how, no wasted movement, no false starts, no long searching adjustments through the scope like rookies made when they doubted themselves. Maggie had set her data, taken her breath, and delivered the shot with the ease of someone reaching for a familiar teacup. Williams called the score through the loudspeaker. Another 109. The perfection felt almost insulting. Someone in the crowd muttered, "No way." Another whispered, That's not possible." Maggie didn't react. She was already adjusting for the next shot, as if the crowd's awe belonged to someone else entirely. Her fingers moved across the scope's turrets like a pianist finding notes she'd played. For decades, the second shot rang steel again. So did the third. And when the fifth landed in exactly the same impossible grouping, Morrison finally stepped forward. "All right," he said, his voice cutting through the air. "Let's see what you do when the targets start moving." if he'd expected her to flinch at the mention of the advanced tactical course. He was disappointed. She stood, dusted off her knees, and walked toward the starting position like she'd been waiting for him to say those words all morning. The moving target course was Fort Braxton's crown jewel, a $2 million investment, designed to make even elite operators miss under pressure. Targets popped up at random ranges, vanishing in under 3 seconds. They appeared partially obscured, at angles or mid-stride to simulate real combat movement. The record stood at 47 seconds for 12 confirmed hits. Morrison had been there when that record was set. He remembered the operator's sweat-soaked shirt, the raw edge of desperation in his breathing. He remembered thinking no one would ever beat it. The klaxon sounded. The first target jumped up at 150 yards. Maggie's rifle was already tracking. Before it fully appeared, the crack came a fraction of a second later. Perfect hit. The second target appeared farther back, angled. She didn't even pause between adjustments. Her body shifted, hips and shoulders working as one. Scope already aligned, shot breaking clean. By the fourth target, Morrison realized something unsettling. She wasn't just reacting. She was anticipating. Her movements were so fluid they seemed almost predictive, as though she knew exactly where the targets would appear. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation, no visible calculation, just clean, precise execution. When the last target fell, the range froze. The digital timer blinked 347 seconds. It didn't just beat the record, it obliterated it. Williams' voice cracked as he read the time aloud. Somewhere in the crowd, someone let out a low whistle. Someone else muttered, "Holy," but didn't finish the word. Maggie simply lowered her rifle and asked, "What else do you have?" Her tone was light, almost conversational, as if she were browsing produce at a market, not dismantling years of military marksmanship standards. Williams glanced at Morrison. The colonel didn't answer. He was looking toward the far end of the range, toward the section that wasn't used for public demonstrations. The Devil's Triangle. It wasn't a course for the faint of heart. 3 steel targets, distances of 600, 750, and 900 yards. Hitting all 3 required instant recalculation between shots, not just for wind and elevation, but for the subtle environmental shifts that happened in those few seconds. Even seasoned snipers struggled there. Success wasn't guaranteed. On a perfect day, and today's crosswind was enough to ruin a pro's grouping. The record's 2 minutes, 15 seconds, Williams told her. SEAL Team 6 shooter, legend in the community. Maggie tilted her head slightly. And how long ago was that record set? 3 years. Her faint smile didn't reach her eyes. Let's see if it's still standing. The crowd swelled as words spread through the base's unofficial grapevine. Marines abandoned maintenance checks. Army Rangers drifted in from the obstacle course. Even clerks from the admin building found their way to the range's edge. She moved slowly, deliberately, setting her gear down with the same care someone might give to placing a photograph on a mantle. The tote bag yielded. Her tools, a compact weather station, a ballistics notebook so worn the leather was soft as fabric, a small wind gauge. Morrison found himself stepping closer. He taught wind calls to countless recruits, and most fumbled with the math under pressure. What she was writing in that notebook wasn't basic. These were advanced equations, shorthand notations that told him she wasn't just competent. She was in a league entirely separate from the men he'd trained. "You understand," he said quietly. "This course has broken some of the best shooters in the world." "I didn't drive 800 miles, she replied without looking up. To quit when things got interesting. When she lay prone, the stillness that fell over the range was almost reverent. The first target shimmered in the afternoon heat, a mirage dancing over it like a dare. Williams' voice came over the speakers. "Beginning Devil's Triangle attempt." Now, the crack of the first shot rolled across the field. A heartbeat later, the steel rang at 600 yards. The second target, 750, fell in less than 10 seconds. Then came the hardest, 900 yards. The shot required 20 feet of drop compensation. One wrong breath could send it inches wide. A crosswind shift could turn it into a clean miss. She made her adjustment in 12 seconds. Fired. A faint metallic ring drifted back across the distance. The electronic scoreboard confirmed it. 3 hits, 3 perfect scores. Time, 1 minute. 47 seconds. No one spoke at first. Then the noise hit like a wave. Soldiers who had faced down gunfire overseas were cheering, clapping, even shouting her name. And through it all, Maggie simply sat up, exhaled, and started breaking down her rifle. It was Morrison who finally stepped forward, the words catching in his throat. "Who are you?" She looked up at him, the faintest trace of sadness in her smile. "My name is Margaret O'Brien. Most folks call me Maggie." She paused. "And I suppose it's time I told you why I'm here." Why was the base suddenly so quiet? It wasn't the silence of discipline, the kind Morrison demanded during drills. This was different. It was the kind of stillness that falls over a crowd when they realize they've just witnessed something they may never see again. Maggie O'Brien sat cross-legged on the concrete, rifle across her lap, hands resting lightly on the stock. She didn't look like she had just shattered every record Fort Braxton held sacred. She looked like a grandmother. Resting after a walk, the colonel's question still hung in the air. "Who are you?" Her gaze swept the faces around her. Men and women whose training defined them, whose pride was built on skill, honed through sweat, exhaustion, and countless hours on the range. She could feel the shift in the way they looked at her now. No more smirks, no more dismissive glances. There was weight behind their eyes. "My name is Margaret O'Brien," she began, her voice steady but carrying a note of something deeper. Not pride exactly, but a kind of earned gravity. "Most folks call me Maggie, and I suppose it's time I told you the truth about why I'm really here." A faint breeze carried the smell of gun oil and warm steel across the range. No one moved. "I wasn't always this," she said, gesturing to the cardigan, the thrift store dress. "A long time ago, I wore a different uniform, one you won't find in the base archives. I served in Army intelligence. The details of that service were buried so deep even the Pentagon needed special clearance to find them." Morrison's eyes narrowed, but he didn't interrupt. "I left the military to raise a family," she continued. "My husband, Tom, was my anchor. The kind of man who never cared about titles or medals, just whether you could keep your word. We built a life in Montana, quiet, honest, until the day we weren't so lucky anymore." Her hand tightened briefly on the rifle stock. 8 years ago, Tom was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The treatments weren't covered. Insurance called them experimental. She smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. You learn quickly that experimental is just another word for too expensive. The bills would have taken our home, our land, everything. The crowd was silent, but Morrison caught the way several younger soldiers shifted their weight. They knew what it meant to face something you couldn't fight with bullets or training. "So I did the only thing I knew how to do," she said. "I picked up my rifle again. Not for the army this time, for the underground." A murmur rippled through the group. In the world of competitive shooting, the big tournaments, the ones with real money, aren't always advertised. They happen in barns and abandoned warehouses, out in deserts where no one asks questions. Men travel hundreds of miles, convinced they can't be beaten. That's where Montana Maggie was born. I'd walk in looking like a charity case, let them underestimate me, and then... She didn't need to finish this sentence. Every soldier present could fill in the rest. "In 6 years, I won more than $300,000, enough to cover every treatment, every hospital stay, every medication Tom needed. It wasn't about pride. It was about time, buying more of it for him." Her voice dipped lower now, almost as if speaking to herself. Last spring, I lost him. Before he died, he made me promise to stop hiding what I could do, said the world needed. To see that capability comes in all shapes, all sizes, all ages. That maybe I could help train those who would protect others. She looked up then, eyes clear. My grandson Billy didn't dare me to come here. He begged me. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind nudging the flags at the far end of the range. Then Williams, the range master, stepped forward. His voice was quiet but carried across the assembly. I've been a Marine for 23 years. I've trained men who could put a bullet through a coin at 200 yards. I've never seen what you just did. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Morrison's jaw was tight. The part of him that lived for order hated how quickly his base had been pulled into chaos over one civilian. But another part, the part that had watched her break every record in his book without a tremor of doubt, couldn't look away from the opportunity staring him in the face. You understand, he said finally, that what you've shown here, it changes things. I hope so, she replied simply. It was General Hayes who broke the moment. No one had noticed her arrival, not until the soldiers instinctively moved aside to make space. Her presence was like gravity, pulling attention. Toward her, Mrs. O'Brien, the general said, extending a hand. I think it's time we talked about what comes next. They moved to the edge of the range, the general walking alongside her while Morrison trailed behind. Hayes spoke in low tones, but enough drifted back for Morrison to catch pieces of it. Instructor position, advanced marksmanship. Classified clearance review. By the time they stopped, the decision had been made. Within 24 hours, Maggie O'Brien would be Fort Braxton's new advanced marksmanship instructor. The announcement rippled through the base like a shockwave in the barracks. Soldiers who'd once laughed about the grandma with a tote bag were now debating whether they'd get a slot in her first class. In the mess hall, conversations about weekend plans shifted to whispered theories about what her military record might hold. Even the motor pool got wind of it, mechanics glancing toward the range as if expecting her to wander by and fix an engine. With the same precision she used on a rifle that night, as the base lights flickered against the darkening sky, Morrison sat in his office, staring at her name on the new training roster. He couldn't shake the feeling that the woman who had walked onto his base that morning wasn't just going to teach them to shoot better. She was going to change the way they saw the world. Why did they sign up if they didn't believe she belonged? The first morning of her instructor role, Maggie O'Brien walked into the advanced marksmanship classroom at Fort Braxton, carrying that same faded tote bag. Inside, not a single thing had changed. Same rifle, same notebook, same tools. But the way people looked at her had. Some faces showed open curiosity. Others were guarded, skeptical, even resentful. 17 operators sat at the long tables. Navy SEALs, Delta Force, Rangers, snipers who'd already proven themselves in combat. They'd all seen the footage, her impossible runs through the range, her perfect scores, and still, a few of them carried the posture of men who thought they had nothing to learn. Maggie didn't start with introductions. She just set her tote bag on the desk and let the room go quiet. You've all read the manuals, she said finally, her voice calm. Measured. You've all fired more rounds than I can count. You know the science, the angles, the math. But here's the thing. She paused, letting her gaze move slowly from one face to another. None of that matters when your hands shake. A ranger in the back smirked. Ma'am, with respect. My hands don't shake. Her eyes met his, steady and unblinking. Then, you haven't lived long enough. The room went still. She didn't need to raise her voice. The weight in her tone did the work. I'm not here to make you better at shooting. I'm here to make you better at missing less, and there's a difference. She pulled a folded sheet of paper from her tote and laid it on the table. It was a target printout, a clean, perfect grouping, and beside it, another, with shots. scattered in a jagged arc. "This," she said, pointing to the scattered holes, "is what happens when you let your heart rate decide for you, when you breathe wrong, when you take the shot before your mind's ready, and this," she tapped. "The perfect grouping is what happens when you're in control, and control is not about muscle, it's about discipline." The smirk in the back row faded. The morning was theory, wind calls, mirage reading, environmental compensation. But Maggie didn't lecture from a podium. She sat among them, asked questions they weren't expecting, made them explain why a certain shot would miss before they even touched their rifles. When they moved to the range, she set the first drill. It wasn't the usual warm-up. She had them start at 600 yards. In wind just strong enough to matter, a SEAL named Harper, tall, broad, the kind of build that made body armor look like it belonged there, went first. His shot was good. Clean hit. Maggie nodded, then asked him to take the same shot again. "But with a twist. You have 15 seconds, she said, "and your target is moving." He hesitated. 15 seconds was nothing for a long-range calculation in shifting wind. But he adjusted quickly, fired, and missed. "You're thinking too slow," she said simply. "Combat doesn't wait for you to do the math. You should already know your hold before you're even behind the rifle." One by one, she broke them down. Not cruelly, not by yelling. She let the misses speak for themselves. When frustration showed in their posture, she offered a fix so small it seemed trivial. Adjust your elbow. Change your breathing cycle. Check your cheek weld. And suddenly, their shots landed. By midday, the mood had shifted. The ones who'd been smirking now listened without the edge in their eyes. During the lunch break, Morrison appeared at the far end of the range. He didn't say a word, just leaned against the fence, watching. The afternoon drill was harder. 3 targets at staggered distances, all appearing for just 3 seconds. Maggie didn't fire a shot. She stood behind them, timing their runs, calling corrections, teaching them to feel the wind rather than stare at instruments. When a Delta operator named Ruiz slammed his fist against the bench after his 3rd miss, she stepped forward. "Ruiz," she said quietly, "you've been looking at the flag for every read. You're letting it tell you the story. But the flag's late. It tells you what was happening, not what's happening now." She pointed toward the grass halfway downrange. "Watch there. The shimmer tells you more than the flag ever will." He tried again, hit. The look on his face said more than words could. By the end of the day, the operators weren't just listening. They were leaning in, asking questions they wouldn't have admitted needing answered that morning. When the last rifle case was closed, Morrison approached. "You've got their attention," he said, keeping his voice low. "They've got skill," she replied, "but skill without humility. As a ceiling, my job is to break that ceiling." Morrison nodded. But there was something in his expression, not skepticism. Exactly, but caution. He knew soldiers. He knew how quickly respect could turn if pride was bruised too hard. "Tomorrow," she said, "we'll see who's willing to learn under pressure." That night in the barracks, the talk wasn't about her age anymore. It wasn't about the tote bag or the cardigan. It was about the drills she'd run, the subtle corrections that had turned misses into hits, the way she seemed to see their mistakes before they made them. And somewhere in that shift, Maggie O'Brien was no longer the outsider who'd walked onto their range uninvited. She was becoming something else, a force that made them better, whether they liked it or not. Why was it always the second day that broke them? Maggie O'Brien had learned that lesson years ago, long before she ever stepped onto Fort Braxton's concrete. The first day was curiosity, the benefit of the doubt, maybe even enthusiasm. The second day was when the resistance came, when people decided they'd learned enough, that they didn't need her. By the time she reached the range that morning, she could already read it in their body language. Crossed arms, restless hands, operators talking low to each other, but going silent when she walked by. She didn't take it personally. She'd seen it before. from overconfident men in underground tournaments, from recruits in classified training units. The trick wasn't to fight the resistance. The trick was to let them see themselves fail. Today, she said, standing in front of the 17 men and women she'd been handed, you're going to find out what kind of shooters you are underweight. The murmurs started instantly. Weight meant stress, stress meant mistakes. She set the drill without explanation. Full kit, body armor, helmet, loaded rucksacks. 15 minutes of wind sprints to raise their heart rates before they ever touched a rifle. Ruiz, the Delta operator from the day before, muttered something about CrossFit with bullets. They started the sprints. The August sun was already baking the concrete. Sweat darkened their uniforms when they were gasping for air. She led them to the firing line. 3 targets, she said. 200, 400, 700 yards. You have 25 seconds from the moment the first target appears to hit all 3. Miss one, you start over. Harper, the tall SEAL, went first. He missed the 700-yard target by 2 inches. His jaw tightened as she simply said, again. It took him 3 tries. By the 5th operator, frustration was creeping in. They weren't used to missing this much. Maggie didn't raise her voice, didn't shame them, but she didn't let a single sloppy movement slide. Your cheek welds off. You held your breath too long. You're chasing the target instead of leading it. The corrections were precise, surgical, and maddening. Halfway through the morning, Ruiz stepped up. He nailed the first 2 targets clean. The last 700 yards hung in the air, the steel plate shimmering in the heat. He missed. Again, she said. He reloaded. Fired miss. The 3rd try was worse. His stance was off. Frustration bleeding into his grip. He turned, exhaling hard. With all due respect, ma'am, you're sitting back here calling my mistakes. Maybe you ought to show us how it's done. The range went silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Maggie didn't flinch. Is that what you need, Ruiz? Proof? He held her gaze. I just think if you're going to run us into the dirt, you ought to be able to do it yourself. She nodded once. Fine. Load the course. Williams, the rangemaster, looked to Morrison, who had arrived mid-morning to observe. The colonel didn't intervene. Maggie didn't ask for reduced weight. She shrugged into the same body armor they wore, tightened the straps, and took the rucksack from Harper without a word. When she walked to the start line, Ruiz was smirking again, but there was something nervous in it now. The whistle blew. She launched forward. Her stride wasn't fast, but it was steady. No wasted energy, no wild breathing. She dropped prone at the firing line in one smooth motion. First target, 200 yards. Hit. Second, 400. Hit third, 700. She didn't hesitate, didn't overaim. The steel rang. She stood, unbuckling the vest, and handed the ruck back to Harper. Again? She asked Ruiz, voice flat. He didn't answer. The others didn't need him to. For the rest of the day, no one questioned her right to be there. By late afternoon, the drill shifted. She introduced chaos scenarios, targets that appeared in unpredictable sequences with no warning about distance or position. The operators had to rely on instinct and muscle memory instead of perfect setup. One scenario caught Harper off guard. 2 targets at drastically different distances appearing, only seconds apart. He missed the second. She didn't criticize. She just reset the drill and made him run it again. And again. Until he got it when the last shot of the day rang out. The group was exhausted. Not from the physical load, though that had been heavy, but from the mental pressure. Maggie knew that was the point. A shooter could be trained to hit steel. In perfect conditions, what mattered was hitting under the worst ones. As they packed their gear, Morrison stepped up beside her. You handled Ruiz well, he said. Didn't need to handle him, she replied. Just needed him to see the truth for himself. And what truth is that? That I'm not here to prove I can shoot, she said. I'm here to prove they can. The colonel studied her for a moment, then gave a short nod. Tomorrow, I want to see what you can do with live scenario engagement. You'll have the shoot house. She smiled faintly. Then tomorrow they'll learn the most important lesson of all. Why did the building feel colder than the air outside? It was mid-morning when Maggie O'Brien walked the operators up to Fort Braxton's shoot house, a 2-story, cinder block structure built like a maze. Inside, every hallway, every room, every corner could hold a target. Some were hostiles, some friendlies. The only rule: hit the wrong one, and you failed for years. Morrison had used this course to separate the good shooters from the great. A single hesitation or an uncontrolled shot could cost precious seconds or a life in a real fight. This time, Maggie was in charge. She let them stand in the sunlight. Outside while she spoke, her voice level. This is not a speed run. This is about control. A slow miss is better than a fast mistake. And remember, not every target you see needs to be shot. That last sentence drew a few raised brows. They'd all done judgment calls before, but the way she said it carried weight, like she was setting them up for something. They ran in. Pears, Harper, and Ruiz went first, from the observation booth above. Maggie watched them through the glass, the way they hugged corners, the snap of their rifles as they cleared rooms. They moved well, but she could see it already. Too aggressive. On entry, eyes jumping from one target to the next without fully registering. Halfway through, a target popped up. A man holding a weapon, but with a hostage shielded in front of him. Ruiz fired. The round hit the hostage's square in the chest. In a real fight, that would have been a death. When they exited, Ruiz tried to brush it off. Hostage was blocking most of the frame. Had to take the shot. Maggie shook her head. No, you chose to take it. And you chose wrong. There's a difference. Next pair. Same problem. Not with the hostage this time, but with a friendly target, an unarmed civilian in the scenario, getting hit in the chaos. By the time the 5th pair finished, only 3 had made it through without shooting something they shouldn't. The group was quieter now, their earlier confidence dulled. Maggie stepped down from the booth and stood in front of them. Anyone can pull a trigger, she said. Most of you already shoot well enough to pass every qualification on this base, but skill without judgment. She let the pause stretch. Is just luck with a countdown. She saw the truth of it landing in their faces, but she wasn't done. Reset the course, she told Williams. I'm going in. A ripple went through the group. She hadn't said she would run it herself. She wore no body armor this time, just ear protection, shooting glasses and her rifle when the buzzer sounded. She moved through the first doorway without rush or hesitation, muzzle low until the instant she needed it high. First room. 2 targets, 1 with a weapon, 1 with a camera. The armed one dropped before the second target even finished its program. Movement, second hallway. A man crouched, weapon at his feet. She didn't fire. The pace was steady, methodical. At one point, she crossed an open doorway where 2 hostile targets popped up at once. Instead of snapping to the first, she shifted, took the harder angle, then pivoted back for the second. Both hits clean, both hostages untouched. In the last room, the hardest target of the course appeared, a moving hostile weaving between 2 civilians. Maggie's breathing didn't even change. She waited until the hostile's shoulder cleared, fired 1 round, and moved to the exit. When the lights came up, the scoreboard overhead read 0 friendly hits, 0 misses. Time within the top 10 of the base record board. She cleared her rifle, handed it to Williams without looking at the screen, and faced the group. Your enemy is not always the target in front of you. Sometimes it's the one in your head telling you speed is more important than thinking. No one argued. Even Ruiz kept his eyes down. For the rest of the morning, she drilled them again. Same course, over and over. By midday, the change was visible. Slower entries, more scanning before firing. They were starting to choose their shots after the final run. Morrison met her outside. "You made your point." "Not yet," she said. "Tomorrow, they run the course again, but not in daylight." He frowned. "Night shoot?" "Even for this group, that's exactly what they need," she said. "And I'll run it first." That night, the operators didn't talk much in the mess hall. The base rumor mill was already alive. The new instructor planning to beat the shoot house in full darkness. Some thought it was impossible. Some thought she might actually do it. Morrison didn't say what he thought, but when he walked past her in the hallway later, she was at a table alone, notebook open, drawing the layout of the shoot house from memory. Not for herself. She'd already memorized it. She was working out their mistakes. Why did the dark feel heavier tonight? Fort Braxton's range lights were off. The only illumination came from a sliver of moon struggling through thick cloud cover. The shoot house, the same cinder block structure they'd walked through, 100 times in daylight, now looked like a black hole in the middle of the compound. The operators stood in a loose semicircle outside, checking the air. Some rolled their shoulders like they could shake off the nerves. Others stared at the building, memorizing what little they could see of its outline. Night shoots were unforgiving. The human brain wasn't built for rapid threat assessment in low light. Edges blurred, shadows became threats. The same doorways they'd cleared with confidence yesterday would now feel like pits with no bottom. Maggie O'Brien stepped forward. No speech, no warm-up, just her voice in the quiet. Same rules. Friendlies are mixed with hostiles. Miss one or shoot the wrong one and you fail. Except now, you can't trust your eyes. She tightened her ear protection, adjusted her glasses, and slung her rifle. When Morrison nodded from the observation booth, the buzzer sounded. Her first step into the building was deliberate. She didn't rush the entry, didn't let the darkness pull her pace. The muzzle of her rifle floated, quiet and steady, the barrel moving like the minute hand of a clock, never jerking, never skipping. The first target popped. She didn't. Fire. The silhouette was holding something, but not high enough, not in the right grip. She'd seen too many operators pull the trigger on that kind of outline in low light. 2 steps later, the second target emerged. Hostile, she fired once. The steel rang faintly in the gloom. From the booth, Morrison leaned forward. The night. Shoots weren't meant to be clean. They were meant to disorient, yet she was moving as if the darkness was just another layer of information. Midway through, the course threw its hardest scenario. 2 hostiles in opposite corners, both appearing at the same time. Most shooters would snap to one and miss the other's window. Maggie pivoted mid-kneel, firing left and right in a rhythm that sounded more like a metronome than panic. At the final hallway, a civilian target appeared inches in front of a moving hostile. She waited, then fired through the narrow gap as the hostile shifted. The civilian board stayed untouched when she exited. The scoreboard lit. 0 friendly hits, 0 misses, time in the top 5. She handed her rifle to Williams, stepping aside without a word. "Who's first?" she asked the group. No one volunteered immediately. Harper stepped forward at last. "I'll go." One by one, they ran the course. The darkness stripped them bare. Even the best daylight shooters stumbled, firing too soon, missing in panic. Misidentifying targets, Maggie didn't mock their mistakes. She used each one as a live lesson, pointing out the subtle things they'd missed. "Your barrel dipped on the doorway. That's why you hit low. You heard the target frame creak before it popped. That's your warning. Use it. You hesitated on the second hostile. That hesitation, that's where someone else dies." By midnight, the mood was different. The bravado from earlier in the week had been burned away. They weren't just learning how to shoot better. They were learning how to see better after the final run. Morrison came down from the booth. "You proved your point," he said quietly. Maggie shook her head. "Not yet." She turned to the group. "Tomorrow, we take all of this and move outside. Real terrain, real distance, No walls, no patterns, because in the field, the range doesn't end at the doorway. No one groaned. No one rolled their eyes. They just nodded. As the group packed their gear, Ruiz lingered near the edge of the formation. When the others drifted off, he stepped closer to her. "I was wrong," he said simply. She met his gaze. "About what?" "That you were here to prove yourself. You're here to prove us." She didn't answer, just gave a faint nod. That night, back in her small base quarters, she opened her leather-bound notebook, not to record her own data. She knew those numbers by heart, but to mark each operator's strengths and weaknesses. She drew wind patterns from the afternoon, circled key points where their breathing had faltered, sketched angles where they'd hesitated. The work wasn't about keeping score. It was about making sure they wouldn't fail when it mattered. On the last page, she wrote one sentence, underlined twice. "Speed fades, clarity lasts." Why did the air feel sharper that morning? The last day of training began before sunrise. The operators gathered in the pre-dawn haze, their breath visible in the cool air, the field beyond them still swallowed in fog. Somewhere out there, hidden in the rolling terrain, were the targets. Maggie O'Brien had set them herself the day before, and no one knew where or how many there would be. This wasn't a flat, predictable range. This was uneven ground, grass wet with dew, distant, tree lines shifting in the fog, and no neat distances marked with painted stakes. She stood in front of them, rifle slung, voice quiet but carrying. "Today you find out if you can read the world as well as you can read a range card. You'll work in pairs. You'll move through the course as if you were alone out there. Every decision is yours. You'll know you made the wrong one when you hear steel." Harper raised a brow. "And if we hear nothing?" She let a faint smile touch her lips. "Then maybe you lived." The first pair stepped off. The fog was thick enough that shapes appeared and vanished like ghosts. A target might be 50 yards away or 300. Some stood still, others moved. Maggie and Morrison watched from a ridge with binoculars. Morrison was quiet, tracking each movement. Maggie wasn't looking at the targets. She was watching the shooters. Ruiz and his partner came to a rise where a faint silhouette stood. At the tree line, Ruiz raised his rifle. Maggie murmured, "Too quick." A shot rang. The wrong target dropped. When they returned, she didn't scold. She just asked, "Why that shot?" "Looked armed," Ruiz said. "Looked," she repeated. "In the field, looked is a coin toss, and the wrong side of that coin changes everything." Mid-morning, Harper's team reached the furthest stretch, an open field with intermittent fog breaks. A moving hostile appeared, almost at the same time as a civilian target stepping into view from the opposite side. Harper swung toward the hostile, but his partner, seeing the civilian's movement first, hesitated. The shot was late. They missed entirely. When they came back, Harper muttered, "If we'd had 2 more seconds." "You don't get 2 more seconds," Maggie said. "You get what you get. That's why clarity matters more than speed." The final pair went out. The course had been running for hours. The fog was starting to lift. And then it happened. From the ridge, Maggie saw movement, but not from one of her targets. A figure in camo stepped into the field from beyond the course boundary. Rifle slung low. Morrison caught it too. "That's not one of ours," he said sharply, reaching for his radio before the words were out. A shot cracked from the field. The round hit dirt 2 yards from the intruder's boots. Not a miss, a warning. Maggie's hand was already on her rifle. She slid down the slope, moving low, using the terrain. Morrison followed but stayed back, radioing the range control to halt all shooters from 70 yards. She saw it clearly, a civilian hunter who'd wandered past the posted signs, confused, frozen in place as one of her trainees stood with rifle raised. "Hold," she called. The trainee flinched but didn't lower the weapon. Maggie moved into his peripheral vision, rifle down, voice steady. "Not every figure in your sights is your enemy. If you can't tell the difference, you have no business pulling the trigger. Her tone wasn't angry. It was absolute, the kind of voice that didn't leave room for argument. She walked the hunter out of the field herself, past the startled range control officers, and didn't say a word until he was safely beyond the perimeter. When she returned, the group was gathered near the staging area. No one spoke. That, she said, is the real course. Targets don't wear signs telling you what they are. The world doesn't label who's safe and who's not. And sometimes, the best shot you'll ever take is the one you don't. No one smirked. No one crossed their arms. Even Ruiz's gaze was steady now. Without the old challenge in it, Morrison stepped forward, his voice quieter than usual. You've done more than train them to shoot, O'Brien. You've trained them to see. She just nodded. The next week, she was officially listed on the Fort Braxton roster as lead instructor. Advanced marksmanship, her first permanent class, was already overbooked. Not just operators, but instructors from other bases requesting to observe. The videos of her first day, the perfect runs, the record shattered, had gone far beyond the base now. They'd reached forums, social media feeds, even civilian shooting circles. The comments varied, but one phrase appeared over and over: never underestimate the quiet ones. On a warm Friday evening, she walked the range alone, stopping at the Devil's Triangle. The steel still bore faint marks from her record run. She rested a hand on the cool metal, thinking of Tom, of the promise she'd kept. Morrison's voice came from behind her. You know, you could have retired in Montana, kept winning competitions, stayed a ghost. She didn't turn. Ghosts don't change anything. There was a long pause. Then he said, You changed this place. She smiled faintly, but her eyes stayed on the far target. Sometimes, she said, dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of gunpowder from the day's shooting. She breathed it in, not as a victory, but as a reminder that somewhere, someday, one of these operators would be out there, making the right choice under the worst conditions. Because she had been here, and when that happened, she wouldn't need to know. She'd already done her part.